Hi, this is Lili Anderson, and you're listening to Choosing Glory. Thank you for joining me for part 2 for this week, as this is the D&C week of sections 71 through 75. But in this part, I've invited my son Harper to join me in discussing kind of a current issue in the news that a lot of you have heard of course, and some have asked about my opinion. And so I've invited Harper to come and discuss Israel and what's going on in the Middle East, and of course, most currently in the conflict with Iran. Now, just to give a little bit of context for those who may not have followed too much of that, just in the past week or so now, I should have checked the date, but Israel attacked the nuclear facilities of Iran and also took out most of their military leadership in very surgical strikes. Israel is known for precision in their military operations, and they certainly were impressive in how careful they were not to target civilian centers and not to take out civilians, but to specifically seek to destroy Iran's nuclear capabilities. Now, this has been an issue for quite a long time now. President Obama had a treaty with Iran that many have criticized. Thomas Sowell's very critical of Obama's treaty there and said many things about it in a more articulate way than I'm going to quote here, but one of the things he repeated many times was, you cannot negotiate with people who produced suicide bombers. And he said any kind of appeasement with people who are willing to send their sons and daughters on suicide missions is not going to be successful because the culture is just so different and so problematic. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this today, but I've talked before about some of the issues that arise because of moral relativism, where we dismiss the idea of evil and we want to be so politically correct, or now we use the term woke, that we assume that everybody is coming from the same place in terms of their desire to get along or be good neighbors or to be, partners in world trade and all that kind of stuff. So, we do see that has gone really far. It's fulfillment, in my mind, to some extent, of the Book of Mormon warning that Satan in the last days would say, I am no devil, for there is none. In other words, evil doesn't really exist. So it does kind of lead us to that philosophy of moral relativism, and everybody should just get along. And if we would just stop being aggressive, then, the world would be a peaceful place.
I just finished, just a couple months ago, reading the book My Name Used to Be Muhammad. I would recommend that reading for a lot of people. It's about a former Muslim who founded the church. Tito Momin is his name.
Oh, thank you.
And he writes about his experience. He grew up obviously as a Muslim, and his dad legitimately thought he was going to be like the next, what do they call those guys? Imams?
Oh,
Yeah, thought he was going to be like the next imam for that town. He thought he was kind of the chosen one, and he slowly kind of got exposed to other ways of thinking, and he started to rebel in bad ways. He admits that. Like, he says, I was doing things I shouldn't have done, even outside of my Muslim upbringing. It just was not good stuff. And then he got sent to prison. He tried to leave the country. They found him. They put him in prison, and he thought he was going to die there. And I don't love the way the book ends. It ends kind of abruptly because I wanted to hear more about his life after prison, but he doesn't really get into that. But it's still really good. It still shines an interesting light on what that upbringing can be like in some parts of the world. He grew up in, I want to say, it was like Nigeria or something like that. So anyway.
Another woman who has converted to Christianity now from Islam, who has been quite a spokesperson, is Ayan Hirsi Ali.
Yeah.
And she's very articulate, very bright woman who is not aggressive or nasty, but is very firmly spoken about some of the problems with the practice of Islam that she grew up with. And I forget, is she from Somalia?
That sounds right, just based on what you've said about her before to
Could
me.
be yeah, could be, but she's, from Africa, and then she ended up in the Netherlands, and she actually was atheist for quite a while, as she took her a while to decide to leave Islam, and then she more recently has converted to Christianity and is very articulate as a spokesperson to these good things that I'm impressed by some of these people who have been able to give us a glimpse as to what their lives were like under Islam and in those households. And again, there's a broad range, and we're not trying to condemn any individual or any people as a group. Extremes
Right.
are always problematic, as you were saying, even about our church. But I
Let's
want to go back for a second and just say, so, Israel took out nuclear sites and they did a lot of damage. Apparently, they can't get to some of the enrichment facilities of the uranium enrichment, which was the whole issue because reports, which
yeah,
varies. And
let's
there
talk
are
about
some
that.
people who say that there wasn't that much enriched uranium, but a lot of people were saying,
Well, even the IPAC, AIPAC, who, by the way, is not conservative at all. It's a third party,
"Mhm,
a group that goes and they actually monitor countries and how they're using their uranium.
yeah,
And they're the ones that said Iran had taken it up to weapons grade, which was a breach of the treaty from the
right,
get-go. But
right,
you only need anywhere from like 5% generally is what they say. You can find it as high as 20% to power up certain countries and things like that. That isn't still weapons level grade uranium. But theirs was above 50. Theirs was like around 60, and you
yeah, I
need to
think
get
it
to
was
like 80
60%
in
that
order
they
to have
hit,
like nuclear weapon capacity. And IPAC had said that's where they're at. And so that's
which
a clear
I
breach of
understand.
that treaty. And so I don't really care what other sources have to say. IPAC has no vested interest in making Iran look bad or the
Mhm,
United States looking correct in their justification of going after them, much less Israel.
yeah,
So
that's true
that's the
because they're
source
not
that I'm kind of pointing
pro-Front.
out to there personally.
So they had reached that level where, again, reports varied, but they said they were capable of creating, from like 8 to 15 nuclear bombs. And, you know, it doesn't take more than one to do devastating
And now there's I don't know if I trust these reports either, but there's reports apparently some people are floating around the idea that they actually already have a weapon that they were
well,
hiding the whole time.
that's an interesting, yeah, another voice out there. And there's a lot that we don't know and a lot that is speculative in intelligence. I don't know if you remember, Harper, but our audience watched the movie Midway. Hal Holbrook is one of the intelligence officers in that movie, and when he's coming up with ideas about, like, where the Japanese flat tops are, aircraft carriers, and what's gonna happen, they're like, "Well, how certain are you as an intelligence group?" And he goes like, 30%, and they're kind of, like, horrified, and he says, "No, that's good. That's really good."
Yeah.
We consider that amazing in intelligence because there is a lot of speculations, but that's kinda how it works because they don't have absolute knowledge. Now, sometimes it's higher than that, so I don't mean to say that that's still the case, and I don't know exactly what they were working with when the intelligence was telling them about what was going on in Iran, but they were concerned that Iran was closer and closer. Now, some people say, "Well, you've been saying that forever," but one news report said that the people who said that we've said for decades now that Iran is threatening nuclear weapons were discounting the idea that Israel has been actively engaged in trying to sabotage that mission of Iran getting nukes ready. So they have inserted viruses in different military aspects of the Iranian program. They have
So
done surgical things that have been under the table because so they're saying that this would have happened a long time ago if Israel hadn't been kind of like on the case and doing things to sabotage that program already, but it had still advanced to a point where Israel said, "We are not going to let this country, which has so clearly stated that they want to destroy Israel, we're not going to let them have a nuke. We just won't." Now, America has been saying that for a long time too, and the preponderance of citizens of the United States, when polled, say they do not want Iran to have a nuke. But how you deal with that has become quite questionable. I don't want to get too caught in the political part
yeah,
of it.
that's
That's yeah.
I was gonna throw a question out to you.
Go ahead.
Before I do real quick though, I actually met a guy that worked on those viruses that they put into nuclear plants, and he told me, he told me, he said, "We had government contracts and we found backdoor ways of getting into these nuclear facilities and planting bugs, and we saw the meltdown happen in real time. He's like,
Wow.
I was actually shocked he was telling me because I was like, this feels like classified information, but apparently it's out there. And I'm sure if he was telling me, then it's not classified. But um,
That's apparently what they've been doing. Some people are saying like, "Well, why are you getting all excited about it now?" It's because, even in spite of those efforts which have slowed progress down, they haven't been able to completely stop it, and it has gotten to this critical point now. So, at any rate, the bombing happened, but there are some facilities that are underground, and so here's where it becomes an issue, and we're going to really talk about this more about like what are our sentiments as members of the church,
and
you know,
citizens
as
of the
opposed
United
to like the
States.
US itself in terms of like, how pro-Israel, how much should we help Israel?
Yeah.
What is natural for a Latter-day Saint to feel? And I don't know if I can say natural because we're going to find Latter-day Saints on both sides of this argument, or all three sides that are kind of there, which is like either don't be involved at all, be somewhat involved, but not too involved. And of course, be full on in our support of Israel and in stopping the nuclear development. But one of the issues on the table now for the US government is that the US has an armament that they, call in the vernacular a bunker buster that can destroy underground facilities. Plus, it has the delivery capacity to deliver that, which Israel does not have. So the question becomes, like, does America want to do something that would provoke maybe, Iran directly? Although, again, Israel does operate with a lot of support of the US. And when people say we shouldn't be involved at all as a country, it's interesting because we are involved. So the question is kind of how much. One of the ways that we are very involved in the Mideast, even before what happened on October 7th of 2023, is that we have a very strong Navy presence in the Middle East. In fact, I looked up the waterways because I could name a few, but I couldn't remember all of them. Where did I put this? But there are significant bodies of water in the Middle East that the U.S. Navy protects. Some of them include the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, the Strait of Hormuz, the Persian Gulf, and the Arabian Sea. And these are really critical waterways. The Suez Canal is not too far from this area either. So you've got all these places where commercial shipping comes in, and the U.S. Navy, since World War II, has really taken on the role of keeping commercial shipping lanes free so that, it keeps down the piracy, keeps down military action that would interfere with supply chain routes. And in fact, recently, under the new administration in the United States, they upped their presence there and they went after the Houthis, who were a pirate kind of, a terrorist group that were present in some of these bodies of water and in these shipping lanes that had caused a lot of damage to commercial shipping. So some ships were going all the way around Cape Horn instead of, through these Middle East waterways, and that added a lot of time and expense to the supply chain. So anyway, the US is involved and has been for a long time. So it's kind of a question of like how much. And I totally understand why we are anti-war. I understand why, I mean, as a default, we don't want to be aggressive. We don't want to, and I mean, I think this is a understandable Christian concern for a lot of people, and it's not just Christian, but I mean, a lot of people don't want to incite
Let's start
something that
with
would
this.
escalate.
Let's start with this. This thing took over Twitter for at least a day or two. Tucker Carlson has Ted Cruz on his show and asks Ted Cruz, Ted Cruz cites in the Bible, those God says those that bless Israel will also be blessed.
Hmm.
And Tucker kind of presses him on that. And he specifically says, it says that those who bless the nation of Israel or the Israeli government, he said, the Israeli government, which obviously Tucker's trying to say he's separating Israeli as a government nation and the Israeli people, the Jews,
The Jews.
the blessed people of God. And that I think is where the interesting question comes into play, because I've actually seen this a lot on Twitter lately as well, specifically with members of the church saying, well, you know, speaking out and supporting Israel does not mean supporting Israel's government. Like, that's not defending the Jews. And my question ultimately is, how in the world are we supposed to know the difference, at least as of right now? Like, I understand that argument in the sense of like governments are corrupt, which, by the way, if you think the Israeli government is corrupt, which I'm sure it has at least some corrupt branches of it, maybe more than I even know, they're probably just as corrupt as we are in a lot of ways. Now, I don't necessarily love the, just because they are, we can be too, and it doesn't matter, all that stuff. But like the whataboutism.
Hmm.
However, to me, when you go to the prophecy, which is what this all stems from, which is that all nations will war against Israel. And we're seeing that happen and play out in real time, where the US is now shifting its sentiment overall from its population from defend Israel to don't get involved to now, I think the next generation will be let's attack Israel as well. So I think that's what we're going to see in the coming years. Um, how is that prophecy that we know about in the last days, it's in Revelations, how is that not inherently political?
I think that that's a great point. We were discussing this a little bit because otherwise, if we're just saying that you have to be kind to Jews and
That's
all nations are going to come against the Jews, well, then does that
feel
mean
bad for them, but feel bad for them in the
persecution,
process. Yeah.
like persecution in every, or anti-Semitism in every country, that all nations will do that? And then what? I mean, that's not
As long
really
as we feel
fulfilling
bad
prophecy.
for them, and that's us blessing the Israelis, like the people of God, the Jewish people, as long as we feel bad for them, we're doing our part. I have a hard time with that,
It
personally.
seems a little odd. Let's speak about the prophecies a little bit. I looked up some things again. Zechariah is one in the Old Testament, Zechariah 12, that talks about all nations will turn against Israel. It is in Revelation when it talks about Gog and Magog, and I'll get to that in a second. Ezekiel has a lot to say about the last days as well. And in chapter 38, there's a lot through Ezekiel that talks about cities being rebuilt in Israel and in fulfillment of the prophecy of the return of the Jews, which certainly, I mean, remember, Orson Hyde was sent by Joseph Smith
To bless the
to
land.
go and dedicate
Yeah.
Israel for the return of the Jews. And again, how could that not be a political state? How could that not be an organized place that he was doing? In fact, apparently Orson Hyde was in contact with a lot of rabbis in Europe, encouraging them to gather to Israel
Yeah.
in fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. So, right to begin with, in the history of our church, there was an awareness for all the Jews to come together again. And when Ezekiel in chapter 38 talks about the 5 countries that will go against Israel in the last days, just prior to the Antichrist kind of making his play, the 5 countries, let's see if I can get them right. I don't have all the names from Ezekiel. I stopped writing them down, but Gog has been identified as Russia.
What do you mean by like who identified Gog as Russia?
A
This isn't
few
the answer to your
people, a few Bible scholars have talked about where the location is and things like that. And let me add something a little bit later. But Persia is definitely Iran.
question.
Cush is Sudan. Libya is mentioned by name in Ezekiel. And then Gomer, or the house of Tagurma, I think, is Turkey. So those are the 5 nations that they are saying that Bible scholars that particularly look at the last days prophecies will
All
say,
adds
or
up so far. I mean, Russia's already backing Iran.
well, that's the interesting thing, is that's fairly recent, that Iran and Russia have signed partnership kind of treaties that they'll back each other. And
Who's the
some
house
people
of
have called it a
Tagorma?
new axis of evil that is coming with Russia and Iran. And some of these other countries, like Sudan, actually allowed Russia to build some military sites recently, as well as, I'm trying to think, is it Turkey also that has, or Libya perhaps? So, anyway, we're really seeing those
There's one of
possible
these is
alliances.
China.
Well, that's another one that we add to the axis of evil, and I don't know how that plays in. It's not really
Jadon, Tarshish.
it could
One
be.
of them is one of them China.
So, yeah, I mean, I can't tell you that I know the answer to that, but it's
Fascinating though.
pretty fascinating that we're seeing the alliances that are prophesied here in Ezekiel 38 kind of come together and all be against the Jews. Now, of course, Russia has a pretty bad history in terms of their treatment of the Jews. And, maybe some of you have seen Fiddler on the Roof, and you know that all those pogroms and so on were so terrible that many Jews did feel like they had to leave early and so on. I also want to mention this, that just speaking of Latter-day prophecies that are kind of being fulfilled, Jonathan Cahn, who I've quoted before, is a Messianic Jew. Some people still refer to him as Rabbi Cahn because he's educated in a rabbinical tradition. But he has mentioned that the Palestinian flag has four colors in it: red, black, white, and green. And those colors are actually in the flags of many of these countries that have mentioned, not the Soviet Union or the Russia now, but a lot of these other
Right?
countries. Say again?
Red and white are, aren't they? For the
Well, but
Russian.
they're saying these four colors together.
Oh, together.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay.
And he points out that in the book of Revelation, the colors of the horses of the four horsemen of the apocalypse are red, black, white, and the pale horse is a greenish, a pale green. So, so Rabbi Khan is saying that these colors are being represented as this again the symbol of the four horsemen of the apocalypse that come toward the end, and we see them clearly in the Palestinian flag, but also in some of the other neighboring states' flags. Just want to mention a couple of other things. The verse that Harper was referring to in Genesis 12, verse 3, was the promise to Abraham, I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. So, yeah, what does that mean for Latter-day Saints? Now, I'm going to say there's still.
Like, how do we differentiate? Like, anyway, I'm getting on a tangent. Sorry, I'll like keep going.
Well, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, like, the biggest issue I'm having right now is when I see members of the church saying we don't need to support Israel because there's a difference between the Israeli government and the Jewish people that talks about basically in Genesis 12, like you mentioned. But it's like, who are we to differentiate from those two? And if we even want to, how are we going to determine what that even means now? Like, just based off of going off what we know. So the Israeli government is imperfect, but guess what? That houses the most Jews in the world, and it's in
More
their
than half
best
of Israel.
interest to defend their own people. So
Mhm.
who am I to say, well, it wasn't specifically talking about the Israeli government, so I don't really care. I don't see it that way. I see that they're the gatekeepers for the largest single population of Jews around the world. And as long as Genesis 12 says we need to bless these people, then why not back the Israeli government while we're at it? Because there's quotes now going around of Bruce Armour Conkey talking about that same thing. Bruce Armour Conkey specifically mentioned that's not the
The state of Israel.
there's a difference between a political gathering, which, by the way, you already kind of debunked with the Orson Hyde stuff, telling Jewish sects around Europe to go back to Israel and fulfill that gathering. Kind of flies in the face of that, what McConkie was saying. But he says there is a difference between the political gathering and the spiritual gathering. And it's like, tell me what it is then.
Well, or isn't one going to be a precursor for the other? Because
Right.
Um, we do know, I mean, Revelation is very clear on this, as well as Ezekiel and some other Old Testament prophets that talk about the final battle that is going to happen in the plains of Armageddon, which is right there in Israel. So, like, where else is this going to happen? And how would it happen that the nations would come against Israel unless there is a place that is already prophesied, that is there, is actually located there? I mean, again, are they just going to pick out the Jews from all the other countries, and Gog and Magog somehow are going to go after the Jews of America, or after the Jews of Europe, or after the Jews of Russia, or, wherever they are? Like, how is that going to happen without a political gathering? Interestingly, too, and I know I've always felt an affinity to the Jewish people. Like, it started, and
Full
I used to.
disclosure, we are biased.
Yeah, I was gonna say we
Yeah.
met, I can't say that I haven't had this affection for the Jewish people that started when I was very young, and I'm sure some of the things my parents had probably influenced that, but also I started reading a lot of books about World War II and the Holocaust and whatever. And one author, Leon Uris, Uris, that I love his early books, Exodus, Mila 18, QB7. They're just really amazing books that give a lot of history along with his, fictional characters about what happened. And it just seemed so divinely orchestrated. Not that God would inspire Hitler to do the horrible things he did, but we know that God will use evil to accomplish his purposes. He doesn't inspire evil, but he knows it's coming because he knows all things, and I'll
Yeah,
get
that's
to that.
I don't know if I'd say use evil even, because I'm not sure what you mean by that, but I would just say that he allows it to happen more than anything, right? That's where agency comes into play, and he knows that people will use their agency for evil, but he also knows that that's a part of his bigger plan.
Okay, however we want to state that, I'm okay with that. It doesn't bother me to say that he uses, but I don't want to make it sound like God inspires evil because he
Right.
never does. And so that's important to clarify. But what happened there was what sparked the Zionist movement. Like Orson Hyde dedicated the land of Israel prior to that time because Joseph Smith, a prophet of the Restoration, the prophet of the Restoration, saw these things and knew that they would happen. So he's like, let's go ahead and get that dedication going, which actually, anyway, there are lots of nice stories about how that led to the Jerusalem Center, some of those early interactions that the church had with Israel, the land of Israel. But let me just read something about Orson Hyde because I think it's pretty cool. In 1841, the prophet Joseph sent Elder Orson Hyde of a quorum of 12 to dedicate sacred space in Israel. He dedicated the land of Israel for the return of the Jewish people, effective immediately, starting in 1841. That's interesting. He prayed, and these were some of his words: "It is thy good pleasure to restore the kingdom unto Israel." That's political. That's a government.
Absolutely.
Raise up Jerusalem as its capital. That's political. And constitute her people a distinct nation and government. Those are political bodies.
I really, really want, and by the way, you and I both really like McConkie.
I do. I'm
I
a giant
really,
Priscilla
really
fan.
wonder how he would respond with that in mind, and I can't imagine he didn't at least know
I'm
about
sure he was familiar, being the
or maybe
scholar
he
he
just
was.
wasn't thinking of it when he said this quote. I mean, he specifically I have the quote right here. He said, "Let there be no misunderstanding in any discerning mind on this point. This gathering of the Jews to their homeland and their organization into a nation and a kingdom is not the gathering promised by the prophets. It does not fulfill the ancient promises."
Well, it doesn't finish them. I'm going to agree with him on it doesn't complete them because the completion of them is that
Right.
they return to Jesus Christ. Like they come to the Savior and they recognize that he is the Messiah. As which is the big problem, right? They know there's a
Yeah.
Messiah coming. They just missed him. And so I think that that's fair from Elder McConkie to say that it's not going to complete the process, but to me it's a very significant step in the fulfillment of latter-day prophecies. And again, what Elder Hyde said here is beautiful. Going on, he prayed for the quote, "for the gathering together of Judah's scattered remnants according to the predictions of the holy prophets, for the building of Jerusalem again after it has been trodden down by the Gentiles for so long, and for rearing a temple in honor of thy name." Elder Hyde also blessed those who will stand with the Jewish people in this journey. Quote, "Let not their enemies prevail against them, but let the power of the highest protect them." And then going on, just a comment here by the person who I saw this quote from: "We believe that the power of the highest continues to protect his ancient covenant people, the Jewish people, and will continue to bless them in the ancient land of their inheritance." Of course, they've had, a real struggle to survive, but they have survived, and I do believe that the hand of the Almighty has been involved. I'm going to mention one other thing that I found very interesting, that there are agencies. Aliyah is the big one, which is also called the Jewish Agency for Israel. The word Aliyah is a Hebrew word that means to ascend or to go up. And so they use that word to mean going up to Israel. And they have helped, that organization has helped bring 3.5 million Jews to Israel
Wow.
over the last several years, decades, really. Some people have gotten there on their own, or other agencies have helped. Of course, now there are about 8 to 9 million Jews in Israel, which is just, slightly over half the remaining population in the world. And that remaining population is around 16 million, it's estimated. So half or a little more than half are in the state of Israel. And, Zechariah talked about a nation, or actually it wasn't Zechariah. Who was it? Oh, it's Isaiah, who talked in chapter 66 about a nation would be born in a day. And he was talking about the restoration of the Jewish people. And remember, they talked the restoration of Israel, but the only kind of knowable tribe of Israel in this latter day for people who don't have the restored gospel of Jesus Christ is the Jewish people. That is the remnant of Israel, right? That people know because they don't know where the 10 tribes are. We're starting to see that there are the 10 tribes that were in the eastern bloc of, what used to be the Soviet Union. And Ephraim obviously came from Western Europe and came to the United States. Joseph Smith was from Ephraim. The first gatherers are all from Ephraim, and so on. Many members of the church, certainly in the early days especially, were from Ephraim. Manasseh, we also have kind of an idea, but people who are not members of the church don't know where Ephraim is. They don't know where Manasseh is. They don't have that understanding. They don't know where any of the other 10 tribes are. And they don't know where Benjamin is, or, the Jews do have a lot of Levi in them, and they do know who the Levites are. They have different names like Cohen and Khan. Those are Levite names, and there are some others that I'm not familiar with. So anyway, that tribe that was mixed in amongst all the other 11 tribes because they performed the sacrifices and so on are discernible amongst the Jewish people. But other than that, they don't know where the tribes are. So this is the remnant of Israel in the eyes of the world. And that's what Isaiah was talking about, would be reestablished in a day. And of course, that day was in May of 1948, when David Ben-Gurion announced that the state of Israel was now an official government. And again, I'm going to just tell this story because I think it's so moving. There were 7 nations who attacked Israel after the British left. So this is prior to 1948, just after the war, that the British were still in charge of the territory. And they decided it was getting too hot to handle. They were preventing the immigration of Jews. They were not open. Of course, Jews were coming anyway, but there was a lot of conflict about how many should be let in because the Arabs didn't like it. The neighbors didn't like it. So the British decided they were going to get out, and they got out, but they left all the strategic positions in the hands of the Arabs. And a lot of the armaments that were left by the British Army were left in the hands of the Arabs. And honestly, it was expected that there would be a fairly brief and bloody massacre and that there would be no Jewish state. But against all odds, again, I think the hand of the Lord being very clearly evident, the Jewish people that were in that new Zionist movement prevailed and were able to push back the Arab neighbors. Now, that was only the first time, right? Because there have been other wars in the 60s and the 70s where nations would attack.
Like 7-Day War or something in the 60s.
That was one of them. And then the Yom Kippur War, that was just after a group that I was with BYU visited Israel. And they were in a state of heightened awareness. But it was actually just a week or two after we left in our visit. From our visit there was the Yom Kippur War, and they prevailed there too. And every time they got more territory. And they've tried to trade some of that territory that they've gained for peace, which the other neighboring states have agreed that they would take over some of these areas that Israel conquered, and say that they would take them back in order to not fight against Israel, but they usually break those treaties. But right now, they have, prior to October 7th, there was kind of a détente where they had given the Gaza Strip to the Palestinians. And then, of course, it allowed for some serious problems. But I guess I do think that your point is really excellent, that, like, how else could we even identify the remnant of Israel if there weren't a political state? And the language of Orson Hyde is all political. A nation, a government, a
The
capital.
prophecy itself is political. All nations shall war against Israel.
Yeah, against what? Individual Jews in
Yeah,
different
individual
countries?
Jews, which, I mean, like, come on.
That's just persecution. That's not war. You don't war against individuals. You
And
war against nations.
obviously the bigger question, I think we're coming up on our
Yeah.
the time limit here, but like the other big question is, what is necessary for US's involvement? And a lot of people have trepidation because like we shouldn't be involved in any wars that don't have anything to do with us. It's like I get that to a degree for sure. And this is where I feel a little bit like a hypocrite because it's like Russia, Ukraine. I don't really love our involvement there. But I do feel like we do need to have the backs of Israel just based off the prophecy. That's my religious side kicking in. But then people make this argument, we can't send our boys to go over there to die for another war that doesn't involve us. And it's like, well, it kind of does, because in some ways Israel is the first line of defense, because once Israel were to fall, US would be next. It just would happen.
Canary in the coal mine.
Exactly.
They've said that.
But even if that weren't the case, we haven't had any actual outside of the presence that's already there, we're not enlisting new boys, quote unquote, to go over there and fight in that war. It's been all missile based. It's been, and also we're entering in a phase where it's going to be all drones anyway. And so there's
It's been
that.
financial support, military
Yeah,
support, and
they're
power
obviously
support,
against the financial
collaboration.
support, no holds
Mhm,
barred, but
mhm.
and that's a different argument. I mean, that's part of the
Right.
same argument, but I guess just extending off of what I'm saying is nobody has come close to dying in the US on behalf of Israel to this point. So why are we making that argument already? Because this war could end tomorrow, and then all this griping is for naught, is my point. So it's just kind of like, let's just cool our jets a little bit when it comes to that part of the argument.
I do wanna mention again that it's fascinating that so much attention that comes from these prophecies about the world's end, the winding up time before the Savior's return, involve a country which is smaller than Lake Michigan.
Right.
It's it's the size of New Jersey, and that's a tiny
And Lake
landmass.
Michigan, that's not even a good comparison because Lake Michigan's way bigger.
Lake Michigan is way bigger.
Yeah.
It's just this tiny little like, the state of New Jersey in the middle of a desert. Yeah, without oil, as I mentioned last time, the only place in the region without oil. Someone asked me, "Why do you think they don't have oil?" And I'm like, "Maybe because it would be game over if they did," because that would be
Exactly.
would they need another country, if they had, the reserves of oil underground? But anyway, they have
There is
been
some weird irony there that there's a
it
zero.
is. It had to be intentional.
Oh, yeah, had to be. There's no coincidence with that.
Yeah, there's no coincidences like that. Israel, by the way, has blessed the world with a lot of incredible inventions. And I mentioned this last week in a quote by Marco Rubio about how they become this tech oasis, and and I looked up some other things that they have produced in addition to cherry tomatoes and seedless watermelon,
Oh,
drip irrigation. They have figured out how to get water out of air by adding something, and it's this really efficient thing. They've done some things with solar energy. They created the SIM card. They created flash drives. They created all kinds of fascinating technology and have improved on other technologies. The Negev desert, which is like a full-on desert, no water, produces 44% of the agricultural output in
wow.
Israel because they have made the desert bloom. So, they have blessed the world in a lot of ways with the development, the intellectual development, and the technological development. And so it's a fascinating,
This isn't
teeny little spot in the
and
world.
we didn't have this podcast to just, like, blindly be like, "Israel is amazing." Like, we understand there's complexities to this, and again, I'm sure there's plenty of corruption in the Israeli government. I personally believe Mossad had a lot to do with Epstein Island. I believe in that
You
conspiracy.
did
I think it
mention
was
that,
Mossad and the CIA getting together. I think they were saying, "How do we conspire to get
setting
bunch."
people up.
Yeah, exactly. How do we get dirt on people? And how
Possible.
that was funded and everything like that. I'm sure there were some dirty things going on, right? I don't trust the CIA. Why would I trust Mossad? So, but
I don't know
here's
about that,
the point,
but I wouldn't doubt it, and I'm not saying I've known people who've lived in Jewish neighborhoods and have not particularly enjoyed their association
and there's that as well, right?
with those groups,
But
but I
here's
go ahead.
the ultimate point is that this nation, the of Iran specifically, among others, is directly propping up terrorism. Israel has never been known for that, never been associated with any of that. Hamas is completely tied to Iran. They get all their funding from Iran
And Hezbollah and
and
Houthis.
Hezbollah and Houthis.
Mhm.
October 7th was I cannot believe that that did not have an effect on more people rallying for the Israeli people. I'm, like, astonished by that, and that just goes
It's
to show
astonishing.
how Satan really has his grasp on the hearts of people these days. And then if for nothing more, you can identify the evil so clearly, so prevalently among the Iranians, not specifically all the citizens or anything like that, but the government propping up those terrorist organizations that we talked about and how evil that truly is. How is that not enough to get you to say, let's at least try and cut out terrorism as much as possible? And if this is going to be the best and most efficient way to do it, then let's do it. Because I, like, you look at the scriptures, and in fact, what you were talking at the beginning of this is talking about you mentioned Thomas Sowell and how you do not you basically do not negotiate with terrorists, right? Well, guess what? You find that in the Book of Mormon in chapter 55 of Alma. And it's Captain Moroni who's so ticked off at Amaron because Amaron is just completely not only lying to Moroni, he's lying to himself. It's the intellectual dishonesty tied that is rooted in all terrorists, by the way. And he says, you know what? Screw you. I'm not exchanging prisoners with you anymore. I'm just going to get them out of and free them out on my own and keep the prisoners of yours that we already have. I mean, it's that to me is the blueprint that we can all follow. These are terrorists we're dealing with. And we're going to have to we can't play by their rules because they're never honest and they'll only screw you at the end.
Certainly true. Certainly true. Well, I mean, I like that. I like that tie-in to Captain Moroni, who was, of course, a big hero in our family. But brothers and sisters, I hope that this was interesting and maybe useful. It's certainly fun for me always to have Harper on. Really enjoy that. And thanks for joining me to talk about this very current subject that is going to remain a focus of attention, hopefully, for all of us as the prophecies continue to be fulfilled. And as President Nelson has said, let's not miss the majesty of the moment and see that these things are being unveiled. We still don't know exactly how it looks in some of the jots and tittles, but those will be fulfilled. The Lord does his work just as he says, and his prophets have told us. So stay tuned. We're living in exciting times, and I hope that we feel that joyful optimism that Elder Renland mentioned that President Nelson feels when he looks toward the second coming, when he thinks of the coming of Christ and fulfillment of all of those great prophecies, that he will come. When he does, the healing which is already available will scale up in amazing ways, and I look forward to that millennial time of complete healing and restoration. Thanks, Harper. And as usual, also thank my wonderful husband, Chris Anderson, and Doug Larson of Point Digital. Take care.